In this video, I'm going to continue making an amazing case for my client Bob Lazar that he was indeed working at S4, a subbase of Area 51, back engineering the alien propulsion system of a flying saucer. The following is a quick breakdown of the 4 major points I made in the previous video that strongly supported that Bob Lazar is telling the truth and always has been telling the truth regarding his working at S4, back engineering the propulsion system of an alien spacecraft. Number 1, Bob Lazar knew about a subbase of Area 51 called S4. At the time, S4 was not talked about in any capacity within the public domain, nor could you find it in any newspapers or any textbooks or any magazines or anything like that. It's also my understanding that S4 wasn't talked about within the private realm either. Number 2, on 3 separate occasions, Bob Lazar took a unique group of people within visual proximity of S4. He took them at a precise time, at a precise place, and every time he did so, they witnessed spectacular showcases of something flying around in the sky that gave them the impression it was not a conventional aircraft. Now, if he had no connection with what was going on within the Area 51 complex, how would he have known the details of when and where flight tests were being undertaken? Number 3, as part of the vetting process of investigative journalist George Knapp, he had Bob Lazar smack dab in the midst of confirmed Area 51 employees, and they all grilled him, asking him basic questions about the Area 51 premises, such as, what is the first thing you see when you get off the plane? What is the thing over there? What is that color? What is X? What is Y? What is Z? He was able to respond correctly to all these questions. At the end of his grilling, every single confirmed employee that worked out at Area 51 believed that Bob Lazar frequented the premises of Area 51. Number 4, again, as part of George Knapp's vetting process, he had Bob Lazar take 4 separate polygraph tests, asking him questions about his working out at S4, back engineering the propulsion system of an alien spacecraft, and he aced each and every one of those polygraph tests. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, perhaps the 4 factors I just went over are not enough to persuade you that my client Bob Lazar indeed worked out at the Area 51 complex. That's okay. Luckily for you, I have a trump card up my sleeve that I'm going to throw into the mix, which might be just enough to push you over that edge to accept the reality that my client, Bob Lazar, worked at S4, a subbase of Area 51. Back in 1989, Bob Lazar recounted that he witnessed a highly secretive craft known as the Aurora. He successfully drew the back configuration of the craft. He explained that the craft runs on liquid methane. He also conveyed that he once heard the craft and it had a very unusual roar and sounded like the sky was tearing. Years and years later, details of this top secret craft came to light, and Bob Lazar's description accurately detailed the specifications that were revealed about the craft. Make no mistakes about it. There is no way in hell my client could have known those details back in 1989 unless he actually worked out at the Area 51 complex and witnessed this highly secretive craft himself. Now I want to talk about the barrage of harassment and being followed that my client Bob Lazar endured once the security people at S4 began to lose trust in him. On 3 separate occasions, according to Bob Lazar and his good friend Mario Santa Cruz, Bob's car was broken into. It was the 3rd occasion that was the most dramatic. Bob and Mario went to a gym. And because of the previous break-ins, they were particularly meticulous about ensuring that the doors were locked. About a half hour later, they come back from the gym, and the first thing they notice is that all of the car's doors were open. They then noticed that Bob Lazar's wallet and Uzi that were in the glove compartment were sitting there on the seat of the car. Now, if this was a thief, there's no question that thief would have taken the wallet and would have also taken the Uzi submachine gun that Bob Lazar had got in the habit of taking with him because of all of the followings and harassment. But those things were not taken. In my opinion, when you look at the totality of Bob Lazar's experience, there is no question that whoever did this to Bob was a government operative or a team of government operatives. And it was as if they were sending Bob a message that, hey, Bob, we're following you and surveilling you wherever you go, and we could do whatever we want at any moment, and you have to live with that reality. Bob Lazar would experience break-ins into his house. He'd come home, he would see all the windows open, all the doors open, stuff in his house would be moved around, stuff would be written on his chalkboard, and there was one incident that I know of, could be more, in which Bob Lazar called George Knapp right after a break-in. George Knapp comes right over and sees Bob Lazar peering out the window holding an Uzi. And quite frankly, who can blame the man when he's been harassed in the way that he has over a stretch of time? And as icing on the cake, there was an incident where Bob Lazar's back tire was shot out by some unknown person, which appeared to be an attempt on his life. So my client, Mr. Lazar, had to live through an incredibly stressful period of time because he was being harassed and threatened and followed by a bunch of government operatives. Here's what I want you to think about, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. If my client was engaging in such overwhelmingly illegal activity, why didn't the government just prosecute him? Why were they wasting their time with taxpayer dollars hiring government operatives to break into his house, break into his car, shoot out his back tire, threaten him, follow him, mess with him? And what would their incentive be to do all these things? What was Bob Lazar always talking about? Was he telling people about the composite material of stealth fighters? Or talking about secret components of the United States submarine fleet? Was he doing anything like that? The answer is no. And the reality is, if he was doing anything like that, the United States wouldn't even flinch to put him in jail. Instead, he was talking about realities of the United States government that the United States government knew they could not prosecute him on. Otherwise, those realities would come to light, and the rest of American citizens would know all about S4, all about the 9 flying saucers being studied and housed in a hangar cut into the side of a mountain at Papoose Lake. And that is the only reason the United States government did not prosecute him. If he was doing anything else outside of talking about flying saucers and the alien technology at S4, you can bet your bottom dollar the U.S. government would have thrown the book at my client, Bob Lazar. Now I want to talk about the witnesses that came forward to corroborate Bob Lazar's story, yet were subsequently threatened into silence. When Bob Lazar came forward to George Knapp, in the initial stages, he came forward under the pseudonym Dennis because he wasn't yet ready to reveal his identity. When he first came forward to George Knapp at KLAS TV, the day after, I believe it was, George Knapp at the news station received 6 separate phone calls from 6 separate witnesses who wanted to share with George Knapp further information of what was going on out at the Area 51 complex, and in particular, the subbase of S4, to further corroborate Bob Lazar's testimony. Without exception, each and every one of those witnesses, one after the other, were threatened by people of different government agencies. One of those witnesses that called George Knapp at the news station was a man named Roy Byram. He was a tax preparer, and he did taxes for some of the officers working at the Nellis Air Force Range. Roy got to know the Nellis Air Force officers pretty well, and there was occasion where they were all out of town on vacation, sitting around drinking beers, and the officers were telling Roy all about exactly what Bob Lazar was talking about. Flying saucers, back engineering, S4. And subsequently, Roy Byram called George Knapp and wanted to tell him all about what he heard from the Nellis Air Force Base officers when they were out of town drinking beers. The very next day, Roy Byram is visited by two men who say they are from the Secret Service and that they've been hearing that Roy has been issuing threats towards the President of the United States. They go on to tell Roy, you know, if you're talking to certain people about certain matters that you really shouldn't be sharing with them, you might go to jail for that, so you really ought to cut it out. And Roy interpreted this as a roundabout way of saying, you know what, you better shut up and not talk to George Knapp anymore about this S4 business. Another witness that came forward was a woman who worked for the Clark County court system for a defense contractor called Holmes and Naver. She was a stenographer, and she would sit in at meetings with people from the Air Force, the CIA, and her boss, and she would do dictation for those meetings. And there was an incident where they were talking about the wreckage from Roswell being taken to Area 51, and of course she had to dictate that. After these meetings, they would take all her notes, but they wouldn't stop there. They would go so far as to take the ribbons from her typewriter so that it would be impossible to reconstruct the highly confidential material that she typed from dictating those meetings. So she ends up telling this story to a police officer that happens to know George Knapp, and that police officer introduces her to George Knapp, and George Knapp gives her a call and conveys to her, hey, I would love for you to go on the air and tell your story. Don't worry, I'll hide your identity. You won't get in trouble. So the very next day after she agreed to go on the air with George Knapp and share her experience regarding what she dictated at the meetings, she gets a knock on the door by two men who say they are with the defense contracting company Holmes and Naver. They go on to tell her, look, you are under a security clearance and you have restrictions and you are not allowed to be sharing information that you sat in on to do dictation. They then go on to say to her, well, we know that you live in Las Vegas and your daughter lives in Los Angeles and you guys travel back and forth to see each other. There's a lot of desert out there, and if you say the wrong things, something bad might happen to your daughter. After that threat, she decided no longer to continue staying in touch with George Knapp. George Knapp tried to get in touch with her 10 and even 20 years later, and she would not budge. She would not get on the phone with George Knapp. She would not communicate with George Knapp. Somebody got to her, just as somebody got to the other witness I referenced. And George Knapp even shares a third experience with a different witness that was gotten to, but you get the picture. I don't need to go into it. The bottom line, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is here are 6 witnesses that try to get in touch with George Knapp to help corroborate Bob Lazar's story, since they saw Bob Lazar's story on the air at KLAS TV, and they were all threatened. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if the story of Bob Lazar isn't true, then why the hell is the U.S. government trying so hard to ensure that the details of this story and the corroboration of this story does not manifest within the public domain? I want you to think about that very, very deeply when deliberation comes around. Now I want to talk about George Knapp's efforts to get Bob Lazar's records of having worked at the Los Alamos laboratory. Surely, there should be no obstacles to get these records if indeed he worked at Los Alamos, unless, of course, some entity within the government has an agenda to preclude any details arising that would help substantiate the Bob Lazar story. If Bob Lazar worked at Los Alamos in a scientific capacity, then It is not unreasonable by any stretch that he got a job opportunity somewhere out in the Nevada desert to work on something quite special, such as has been outlined, back engineering flying saucers at S4 within the Area 51 complex. George Knapp wrote letters to Los Alamos asking if he ever worked there. Time and again, they would say, nope, we have no records of Bob Lazar ever working at our facility. They've maintained this stance, even though Bob Lazar's name is within the Los Alamos phone book. They've maintained this stance, even though there was a article in the Los Alamos Monitor in which Bob Lazar was featured, and it was said within the article that he worked as a physicist at Los Alamos. But it gets even worse. George Knapp wrote to a headhunting company called Kurt Meyer that finds people jobs at Los Alamos in a scientific and technical capacity. So he writes them and he's like, oh, did you happen to get Bob Lazar a job there? And they respond like, oh, Bob Lazar, yeah, we got him a job there. And then Knapp is like, okay, can I please have the records of this? They're like, sure, no problem. 2.5 years transpire. They keep delaying and delaying and delaying. Then they stop taking George Knapp's calls. And finally, they tell George Knapp, leave us alone. Somebody got to Kirkmeyer and said, you are not giving his records to George Knapp or anybody else. Somebody got to Los Alamos Laboratory and said, you are not giving anybody Bob Lazar's records of having worked here. I don't give a damn that he's in the phone book. I don't give a damn that he was featured in a Los Alamos Monitor article and it was said he was a physicist there. You are not giving any records of him that he worked there, and you will tell people if they inquire that Bob Lazar never worked at Los Alamos. The government also got to witnesses that were coming forward to George Knapp. They were all threatened. Their lives were threatened. Their loved ones' lives were threatened. What is going on? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the course of this trial, I have provided you with important data points that bolster the position that my client Bob Lazar did indeed work at a subbase of Area 51, back engineering alien propulsion system of alien spacecraft. I trust that you will dig deep into your conscience and make the right decision of whether or not my client Bob Lazar has been telling the truth over the past 30 years about his experience at S4. If you believe he's been telling the truth, then I want you to put down in the comment section below #LazarTruth. Alternatively, if you believe he's been lying, then I want you to put down in the comment section below #LazarLying. Over the next 3 days, I'm going to tally all the results, and according to whatever gets the most highest count will determine the outcome of this trial. I want to share with you a new t-shirt that I just developed. I call it UFO Disclosure is a Human Right. How cool would it be to wear a t-shirt that expresses to the world that disclosure is not just a passing interest for you, but you firmly hold that disclosure is a human right for all of mankind. Link for that shirt is in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.